We're going to talk about the assassination of President Lincoln after the failed kidnapping plot. A lot of this you should know from elementary, but I'll be interested to know what you do and don't know. It was the evening of April 14th of 1865 that President and Mrs. Lincoln decided to attend a theater performance at Ford's Theater. It was on the evening of April 14th, 1865, that President and Mrs. Lincoln decided to attend a theater performance at Ford's Theater. The name of the performance that evening was entitled Our American Cousin. Our American Cousin. And that was going to be the evening of April 14th, 1865. Now, there's some information here I'd be interested to know if you knew, that Lincoln had actually invited 14 guests to attend the play with him and his wife. And those guests included General Grant and his wife. So President Lincoln had invited 14 guests to join he and his wife at Our American Cousin at Ford's Theater on April 14th, 1865, including General Ulysses S. Grant and his wife. Well, General Grant canceled his plans to join President Lincoln. He and his wife had made plans to spend time with their children and leave town. Actually, leave town and then spend time with their children. And so he canceled, along with most of the other guests. Matter of fact, only 2 people that were invited of the 14 took Lincoln up on his invitation. So the Lincolns had invited 14 guests to attend the play with them, including General Grant and his wife. General Grant canceled his plans to join President Lincoln for the play, as he and his wife had plans to leave town to spend time with their children. The only 2 people that joined Lincoln and his wife at the play were Major Henry Rathbone and his fiancée, Clara Harris. They were the only 2 that kept their invitation to join President and Mrs. Lincoln at the play that evening. Again, Major Henry Rathbone and his fiancée, Clara Harris, kept their invitation and joined President and Mrs. Lincoln at the theater. Now, we'll talk about what happened prior to that play, and we'll go back to 10:30 in the morning on April 14th, 1865. We'll go back to 10:30 in the morning. And at 10:30 in the morning, on April 14th, 1865, John Wilkes Booth goes to Ford's Theater. He was there to check his mail, which he had delivered to the theater daily. That's where he picked up his mail, because he was an actor. So at 10:30 a.m. on April 14th, 1865, John Wilkes Booth goes to Ford's Theater to check his mail, which he had delivered daily to him there. And as he was checking his mail at Ford's Theater, he ran into the theater manager, a fellow by the name of Henry Clay Ford. So, as John Wilkes Booth is checking his mail the morning of April 14th, 1865, he runs into the theater manager, a fellow by the name of Henry Clay Ford. And what did Ford inform Booth? That the president was coming with his wife to attend the play that evening. So Henry Clay Ford informs John Wilkes Booth in passing, hey, do you know the president and Mrs. Lincoln will be attending the play this evening? Kind of a big deal, wouldn't it be, to Ford's Theater to have the president there? Sure would. Well, because Booth was a well-known actor at Ford's Theater, this would be a perfect place for him to get close enough to the president to assassinate him. That's going through Booth's mind. Wouldn't be unusual to see him at the theater, right? Gets his mail there, performs there regularly. So because Booth is well known as an actor at Ford's Theater, this is going to be the perfect place for him to get close enough to the president to assassinate him. As I mentioned, he was a very popular actor of the day. He was recognized by many in the acting profession. He would not be questioned to his appearance at the theater that evening. It would be a perfect opportunity for John Wilkes Booth if he wants to assassinate the president. But you know what? He doesn't just want to assassinate the president. This assassination plot that's planned by John Wilkes Booth will not only include President Lincoln. How many people knew that? Yeah, the plan is going to involve others. Who are the two others that are going to be in the planned assassination, mate?
Isn't one of them the Secretary of State? at that point?
You're absolutely right. The Secretary of State was William Seward. We talked about him before, William Seward. He was going to be a target that night. Who else would be a natural target, Brian? If you're going to shoot the president, you might as well shoot the vice president too. So Andrew Johnson is also in the assassination plans for that night. So other than Lincoln, both Secretary of State William Seward, S-E-W-A-R-D, and Vice President Andrew Johnson would be targets for assassination. And according to Booth's big plan, these three political assassinations are going to be executed at exactly the same time. They're going to plan it so all three are assassinated at the same time. Now, they didn't have Secret Service in those days, but they did have someone that would guard the president's box at Ford's Theater, and that man was John Parker. So at Ford's Theater, the person who would be guarding Lincoln's box seat was John Parker. What do you think he would do? What was he? Anybody want to guess? What's that? Yeah, but he was a police officer in the Washington, D.C. Police Force. Okay, so he's a Washington, D.C. Police Department officer. And it will be his job to guard the president's box that night at Ford's Theater. Well, at approximately 8:30 p.m. that night, the presidential party arrived at Ford's Theater. Who would be in the presidential party? President Lincoln, Mrs. Lincoln, Henry Rathbone, and his fiancée, Clara Harris. They arrive about 8:30 p.m. that evening. Well, at 9:30 p.m., John Wilkes Booth arrives at the theater. In his possession, he has a single-shot Derringer pistol and a hunting knife. In his possession, he has a single-shot Derringer pistol and a hunting knife, both of which you will see at Ford's Theater Museum the next year. They're both in the museum below the theater. You know what a single-shot Derringer is, my dear? It's a little kind of a small pistol that shoots one shot. Very tiny. And a hunting knife. Now, do you remember Edmund Spangler, the carpenter and the stagehand that worked at the theater we mentioned yesterday? When Booth arrived at the theater, he asked Edmund Spangler to hold his horse. Okay? So upon his arrival, Booth asked Edmund Spangler, who was a carpenter and stagehand at the theater, to hold his horse. Didn't have a place to tie him up there. Well, Spangler was working that night. So he looked around and he saw a young peanut vendor, young boy by the name of Joseph Burroughs, and he asked him to hold Booth's horse in the alley for him. So Spangler kind of dished off that responsibility that Booth gave him to a young peanut vendor. That would be a young kid that sold peanuts as people went into the theater. Joseph Burroughs. And so it would be Joseph Burroughs that would be holding Booth's horse in the alley on orders, so to speak, from Edmund Spangler. So Spangler, who was on duty working at Ford's Theater that night, gave Booth's horse to a young peanut vendor by the name of Joseph Burroughs and asked him to hold Booth's horse in the alley. This is kind of interesting. Once Booth left Spangler with his horse, he headed to a nearby saloon for a drink. Probably to do what? Calm his nerves a little bit, because he usually drank brandy. But this night, he ordered a whiskey, which is more powerful, so to speak. So he evidently had a little bit of a case of the nerves, because he goes to a local saloon, and instead of ordering his usual brandy, he decides to have whiskey instead. Booth left the saloon and arrived back at Ford's Theater at approximately 10:07 p.m. He leaves the saloon and arrives back at Ford's Theater at approximately 1:07 p.m.
Wait, 10:07 or 1:07?
Scott, excuse me, 10:07, yeah. He leaves the saloon and arrives back at Ford's Theater at approximately 10:07 p.m. Well, John Parker, the bodyguard that was assigned to Lincoln that night, had abandoned his post to find a more comfortable seat to watch the rest of the play performance. And you might think that's kind of not very responsible, which it maybe not be, but it was a different time. You didn't have Secret Service. You know, he's sitting there guarding the box, and he's thinking, well, this is kind of, you know, I'm going to go find me a comfortable seat to sit in. That's what he did. So he left the presidential box and went and found a seat in the audience to watch the remainder of the play. Because had the play already started by the time Booth got there? Yes, it had. You probably think to yourself, God, that's a late play. 10:07. It already had started. Okay. Well, after he entered the theater, Booth walked up the staircase toward the presidential box. And you'll see that next year. After entering the theater, Booth walked up the staircase towards the presidential box. Now the presidential box is up in the balcony kind of. I don't know if you've seen pictures of it. And as he walked up the staircase towards this presidential box, he then entered a room that was just outside where the president was sitting. And there was a door here that separated this room from where the president was sitting in the presidential box. So, after entering the theater, Booth walked up the staircase toward the presidential box, and he enters a room just outside where the president is sitting. He barricades the door here behind him with a wooden bar. He then barricades the door behind him with a wooden bar. Because he didn't want anybody to come in on it, right? Well, at approximately 10:15 p.m., Our American Cousin reached Act 3, Scene 2. And you drama people will understand that maybe a little better than the rest of us. At approximately 10:15 p.m., Our American Cousin reached Act 3, Scene 2. And at this point in the performance, actor Harry Hawk performed the funniest line in the play that evening. At Act 3, Scene 2, actor Harry Hawk performs the funniest line in the play that evening. Booth had timed the scene perfectly in his assassination plot because he knew that this actor's line would result in what? Much laughter within the crowd. And approximately 1,700 people were in attendance. That's a big crowd at Ford's Theater. And they're there for the play, and they're there because they know the president is at the play. So at Act 3, Scene 2, when Harry Hawk performs the funniest line in the play that evening, Booth knows that this is going to get loud laughter from the approximate 1,700 people in attendance. And this is going to give Booth the opportunity to open the door of the area that President Lincoln was sitting in when he was watching the performance. Booth had this plan. As soon as that line was given, the laughter roared. He opened that door that separated him from the president's seat in the presidential booth. At that point, Booth opened the door of the presidential box, stuck his .45 caliber single-shot Derringer in the back of President Lincoln's head, and pulled the trigger at point-blank range. 44 caliber, you know anything about guns, kiddos? It's a big mini ball. So Booth opens the door to the presidential box, puts his 44 caliber Derringer against the back of Lincoln's head, and fires the single shot into the president. The bullet goes in the back of his head and lodges behind his right eye. So he shoots him in the back of the head here at an angle, and it lodges behind his right eye. And the president slumps over and loses consciousness immediately. The bullet travels through the back of Lincoln's head and lodges behind his right eye. The president slumps over and lost consciousness immediately. What's the reaction of the presidential booth? Anybody want to guess? Well, she might. But who else is in the presidential booth? Rathbone and his fiancée. Major Rathbone grabbed Booth after the shot, and Booth dropped his Derringer on the floor of the presidential box. Rathbone grabs Booth after the shot, and Booth drops his Derringer on the floor of the presidential box. And what does Booth do next? He pulls out his hunting knife and he slashes Major Rathbone's left arm between the shoulder and his elbow. So right in here, obviously. Booth pulls out the hunting knife and slashes Rathbone's left arm between the shoulder and the elbow. And then what does he do according to history, Andrew? He jumps off the presidential platform onto the stage at Ford's Theater. So he begins to jump down the stage. But how many do you know this? Well, not yet. The reason he falls awkward and breaks his leg. Anybody know? Anybody want to guess? Bleeding. Major Rathbone grabs at Booth's coat to try to prevent him from escape. And Major Rathbone's attempt results in Booth catching his spur on the American flag that was draped over the presidential box, which causes him to fall awkwardly to the 12 feet to the stage, and he breaks his ankle. So after being slashed with that hunting knife, Major Rathbone grabs at Booth, grabs at his coat. It makes his jump awkward. He catches his spur in the American flag, which causes an awkward fall, resulting in Booth breaking his ankle when he landed the 12 feet on the stage. From the stage, he turns and faces the crowd of 1,700 people and shouts, "Sic semper tyrannis," which is Latin meaning, "thus always to tyrants." This is in an actor's form, I guess. He falls, gets up with a broken ankle. He turns to the crowd and yells, "Sic semper tyrannis," which was a Latin phrase that meant, "thus always to tyrants," referring to Lincoln as a tyrant. Okay, he jumps from the stage, lands, breaks his ankle, turns to the crowd of 1,700 and shouts, "Sic semper tyrannis," a Latin phrase meaning "thus always to tyrants." Is that not on your sheet? Yep. Meaning, again, "thus always to tyrants." Dragging his broken leg, he makes his escape through the back door of the stage, painfully mounts his horse, which the poor Burroughs kid is holding unaware of what's going on, and rides off into the night. So dragging his broken ankle, he exits out the back door of the stage, painfully mounts his horse, and rides into the night. Just happened to be a doctor in the house, so to speak, a doctor by the name of Charles Leal. and Lincoln was immediately cared for by Dr. Charles Leal after he was shot by Booth. You heard the old saying, is there a doctor in the house, right? Just happened to be one that night, Dr. Charles Leal, who attended to Lincoln immediately. Lincoln was sitting in a rocking chair in the presidential booth. Dr. Leal laid the president on the floor next to the rocking chair and began artificial resuscitation. Dr. Leal laid President Lincoln down next to the rocking chair he was sitting in the presidential box and began artificial resuscitation. He later rubbed his fingers through Lincoln's hair and found the gap in his skull where the bullet had entered. So he went behind him, from behind him, sure like this, and felt the back of his skull, and finally finding the bullet entrance hole in the back of his head. 3 more doctors arrived and cared for President Lincoln, and each of them knew this wound was mortal, which means what? Going to result in death. Every one of them knew the wound was mortal at the time. Now, where would you take the president at this point? Now, you got to remember it's 1865. Where would you probably take the president after you treated him at the theater? Where would you probably take him to for further treatment, where he'd be comfortable? Home, which is the White House. Normally, they would take him back to the White House, but none of the doctors felt he would survive a trip to the White House, so they took him right across the street from Ford's Theater to the 2nd floor of the Peterson boarding house. Still there today in its original form. Unfortunately,